And now for today's program, which is part of the Wide River Project, an initiative that takes a deep dive and fresh look into the art, history, and issues that both unite and divide the Black and Jewish communities. Dr. Marc Dollinger holds the Richard and Rhoda Goldman Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies and Social Responsibility at San Francisco State University. He also serves on several boards, including the American Jewish Historical Society. Professor Dollinger is the author of 4 scholarly books in American Jewish history and is working on his academic memoir titled Laundering Anti-Semitism, Identity Politics, Ethnic Studies in the University, which traces his experiences as an identified Jewish and Zionist professor in the current political climate. His most recent book is Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in the 1960s. Eric K. Ward is a nationally recognized expert on the relationship between authoritarian movements, hate violence, and preserving inclusive democracy. He is the recipient of the 2021 Civil Courage Prize, the first American in the award's 21-year history. Throughout his career, Eric has worked with community groups, government and business leaders, human rights advocates, and philanthropy. He currently serves as Executive Vice President of Race Forward. Nadine Epstein is an award-winning journalist and author. She has been the editor-in-chief and CEO of Moment magazine since 2004 and is the founder and executive director of the Center for Creative Change. Nadine's most recent book is RBG's Brave and Brilliant Women, 33 Jewish Women to Inspire Everyone, which she wrote in collaboration with the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Please welcome Marc Dollinger, Eric K. Ward, and Nadine Epstein.
Thank you, Suzanne. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Eric and I are so pleased to welcome our friend Marc Dollinger today. Marc is the author of this beautiful book, which you can see all the little notepads, little notes, yellow notes I have in them. It's called Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance of the 1960s. And we're so happy to have him today at the Wide River Project. Marc's groundbreaking book, which originally came out in 2018, is now a new edition has come out, updated, and it's fascinating. And I want to warn you all that some of the preconceptions that you may have about the grand Black and Jewish alliance, especially of the civil rights movement and in the years afterward, some of them may come away shattered after this conversation. But don't worry, what you're going to learn, we're all going to learn, is going to be even more valuable. And before we start, I just want to acknowledge, Marc, you are a white Jewish man. You're not a Jew of color. And I know you can only answer from your own perspective and your perspective of your historic research as a historian. So I just want you to feel comfortable speaking from your own perspective. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, why don't we just start with a really basic, easy question. Why did you write this book? And while we're at it, why did you have to write a revision just 6 years later?
So thank you. First of all, just honored to be here with two folks who I just have admired for years. I got backwards into this book. I wanted to learn about the Jewish ethnic revival of the 1970s. Yes, a journey in Jewish self-discovery for me. I wanted to know about the Soviet Jewry movement and the rebirth of American Zionism and sort of Jewish kids that got more religious than their parents. You know, this is sort of what it was like for me growing up. And then I went to the archives and was drawn back to the 1960s with the social protest movements. And to my shock, the words Black Power just kept coming up over and over again in the sources. I did not anticipate it. I didn't plan on it. I'm finding high holiday sermons by senior level white rabbis in large congregations praising Black Power at a time that, at least when I grew up learning about, the alliance between white Jews and Blacks, was all about, Black Power, Black Panthers, Malcolm X, Stokely, all as negative influences who destroyed, such a good thing. And then, I got drawn back to the 1950s and to the Nation of Islam and to Elijah Muhammad. And by the time I finished sitting in the archives, I'm like, this is actually a very different book than I imagined. So that's how the original book came out. And, it landed just before the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police and the nationwide reckoning on race. And so many in the white Jewish community became very interested in the subject generally, and specifically how their Jewishness and racism and history sort of intersected. And I just think the Google searches brought the book up. And with COVID, I was just doing so many Zoom classes on it. And the book sold out, I think, 3 print runs in the first couple of years, mainly due to the interest around there. And I was invited to write a new preface, sort of connecting the contemporary scene to the themes of the book. And I wrote it, and it was approved and then unapproved by someone they identified as anonymous peer reviewer, and who had 2 specific issues, which we can get into in more detail. The first is that I used the word white supremacy. I actually did a word search of my document. I used it 3 times, I found out. But I think the one that was most offensive to folks, and just to let everyone know, this is pushing back against historical memory. I said that especially since World War II, white Jews have reinforced the system of white supremacy in their lived experience. And the second issue was, I just want to honor and lift Ilana Kaufman, who's founder and CEO of the Jews of Color Initiative, and one who sat with the manuscript before publication and has just been a teacher, an ally of mine, working through my own learning as a white man writing this stuff. And, she said, look, you wrote 250 pages on Blacks and Jews, and not a single page on a Black Jew. How could you do it? And that goes to, Jews of color, Black Jews in particular, and their erasure from history and historiography. And it also goes, even for white Jews, even without Black Jews, Ilana challenged me to ask how much white racial privilege played as a causal agent and influenced this relationship. So I offered an acknowledgement of that error in the new preface, and I was advised that I didn't need to apologize. I thought that I did. So that's a brief overview. We can go whatever directions y'all would be interested in diving.
Look, we're really delighted, Mark, to have you here. And, I do, for those who joined us today, really, as Nadine said, Mark's book, and I'm going to keep holding it up so folks get to see it, really challenges much of what we think we know about Black and Jewish relationships during the Black Power movement, which arises towards the decline of the civil rights era. And as someone who has worked across the civil rights movement for decades, I know that these conversations are often uncomfortable, but necessary if we want to understand where we've been and where we're going. For me, what really resonated, Mark, and I promise this is leading to a question, by the way, is in your book, you really explore how the rise of Black power should not just be seen as a breaking point in the Black Jewish Alliance, as we understand it, but it was actually a catalyst for Jewish activists to reimagine their own identity and politics. And so, with that in mind, talk a little bit about your research about the Jewish community's reaction to the Black Power movement, not being one of surprise, but you almost describe it as a recognition. Talk a little bit how Jewish leaders viewed Black Power as both a challenge and an opportunity to rethink their own place within American society.
And can I just add that there's some different parts of the Jewish community there? So maybe
yes,
ways to look in sort of the more liberal parts of the Jewish community, and then also the conservative parts, politically conservative parts of the Jewish community.
Okay, so this book is about history, historiography, and historical memory, which means history is the past. Historiography is how we've understood our past over time. And historical memory is what we think happened that turns out a lot of cases didn't actually happen. So I was raised with historical memory that what we called Black militancy and Black radicalism, personified by Black power, was a bad thing because it was anti-Zionist, sometimes anti-Semitic, and was the thing that ended what was a wonderful coalition, really, typified by the relationship of King and Rabbi Heschel. So I'm sitting in the American Jewish Historical Society archives in New York, and I'm reading a quote by Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg, who's a Columbia University professor, preeminent rabbi scholar. And he writes and publishes that American Jews should be the ones best able to understand Black power rhetoric, even though we are, and this was his line, on the firing line of its attack. And he wrote that in the late 60s. And I sat with that quote. That quote created the book. It flipped everything. How could somebody in the middle of what appears to be the disillusionment of the coalition be arguing that we as Jews should be the ones who are most empathetic with what's happening? Rabbi Roland Gittleson, Temple Israel of Boston, gives a sermon where he takes it one step further and says, not only should we empathize and understand Black power, but Black power is parallel to the Jewish experience. And since Black power seeks Black pride, why not have a Jewish version of Black power with Jewish pride? And then I'm going to argue that a bunch of movements are going to sort of emerge from this idea. It's okay to be public about your Jewishness, to be unapologetic, to be self-identified, and literally to go in the streets in protest with the Soviet Jewry movement in order to achieve that. And then Nadine, your comment about politics, so those are more on, a lot of those on the political left. On the political right, the Jewish Defense League, founded by Meir Kahane, who's quite the racist, wrote that the Black Panthers of Oakland were his inspiration. Now, the bitter irony is the Black Panthers of Oakland took to arms to patrol the streets to protect Black men from police abuse. He went into urban neighborhoods with vigilante Jewish groups with clubs and weapons, ostensibly to protect Jews. In this case, it was going to be against Black and brown communities that had moved into formerly Jewish neighborhoods when they'd moved out to the suburbs.
Well, let's step back a second here. So first of all, I was really struck by chapter 3, which I recommend everybody read, American Jews and the Rise of Black Power, which takes us back into after the decades of the partnership of the Black-Jewish relationship, what's happening after people begin to realize, well, it didn't really work. The civil rights, the legal equality doesn't really translate to social change. And so something happens in the Black community and something else happens in the Jewish community. And it's very complex in both communities. And so in the Black community, you write about how there's 3 really main groups, the Nation of Islam, SNCC, and the Black Panthers, who begin to take more of the stage away from Martin Luther King and all the other kind of groups that are allied with Jews. So tell us just a little bit, and I'm fascinated. I want to just say also, you talk about how this was I'm curious, this was people in the Jewish community really responded to the Black power, the rise of Black power. But the actual numbers were in 1966, 81% of American Blacks do not support Black militancy, and 84% of Black students do not support them. Those are huge numbers. Yet the perception is so different in the Jewish community. Why?
This gets really deep really quickly and is troubling. And I'll start here. I argue that white Jews, by and large, and of course, I'm going to be reductionist here, but we can get into the fact that all communities are diverse. But just say generally, white Jews joined the civil rights movement. Black America was involved in a movement for racial equality. And that just seems to be like 2 different words for the same thing, but it's not. If you're in a movement for civil rights, then when you get the laws passed, 1964 Civil Rights Act, 1965 Voting Rights Act, Jim Crow is officially illegal. We're done. Congratulations. Everyone can go home. But as many white Jews know, and of course, even more in the Black community, ending legal equality does not end real equality. And in fact, at this moment, many, especially younger folks in the Black community, sort of decide that King's more accommodationist, consensus-based approach is not going to get the job done. And white liberals are abandoning, the movement because they think it's over. So what we then call Black militancy steps in to argue for stronger Black leadership, less involvement by white allies and white liberals. And here, the perception is amongst many white Jews is, look at all that we did for you and look what you did back to us, which is kick us out of your movement and become anti-Zionist. In fact, what my book is trying to argue is that there has always been profound racial difference. And even as the alliance was wonderful amongst a small group of white Jews, still disproportionate to the number of white allies, for sure, that even those, and I'll just take white middle-class Jewish men, understood that there are fundamental differences between the American Jewish experience and the African-American experience. I found a national Jewish leader in 1960 who published an essay that said, guess what, folks? Black America's really upset about a legacy of discrimination. They're really upset about, basically white liberals trying to come in and determine the course of things, which is what the letter of Birmingham jail was ultimately about. And he predicted in 1960 a rise in anti-Semitism from the Black community and greater militancy. So I argue in the book, we can't say that the alliance ended in the mid-60s because of Black power, when even middle-class white Jews 5 years earlier were saying, it's here, it's always been here. And really, I think that all of it has just been a profound engagement about racial difference and racial privilege and white supremacy and how all of that works. And then we attach narratives, which tend to be self-serving for everyone. We all have our narratives on all of our sides, but they do tend to be self-serving. And what this book is just trying to do is sort of lay out diversity. I put in it's not a book in African-American history, but I did put in the data on Black Americans, on sort of radical Black movements, because I wanted the readers to understand that it's not as if like all of Black America was running behind Elijah Muhammad or Malcolm X or Louis Farrakhan, even as it would seem many in white Jewish leadership seem to want to advance that was true.
Well, I want to say that what makes your book so unique is that you're really zooming in on the Jewish community. And I want to ask, and Eric and I are going to ask you more about that, but I just want to ask one more question, but one more point that you actually talk. So the Black Power movement grows, and it actually influences the more traditional civil rights leaders as well, who then begin to push back on the Jewish community, and they are pushing back on this sort of paternalistic tone. And as you used the word self-serving just a second ago, I mean, that's such a, so was that was something real in the Jewish community, that paternalism, that self-servingness. You still hear it today sometimes.
And I think adding on to that, Mark, even before you answer to drop in, it's interesting to tease that out for us. Your book does a phenomenal job of getting into the nuance of this. But for instance, one of the narratives I've always walked around with since the 80s, right, was not this idea that the Jewish community just showed up to help out the Black community. I know that is often the narrative I hear within different Jewish communal spaces. But the story that I heard was that, that segment of Jewish leadership that entered that Civil Rights Alliance, into that Grand Alliance, also was dealing with the aftermath of the pogroms, right? The Holocaust, and attempts to have fled Europe, right? To flee those persecutions to the U.S. Many were blocked by immigration laws that were white supremacist in nature. We know the story, of course, of the Frank family who were turned back from the United States and ultimately met their fate. And often it's called the three cornerstones of civil rights victories in the 1960s. Is, of course, the Civil Rights Act, of course, the Voting Rights Act, but the third is often referred to as the Immigration Act, I believe of 1964, 65. Someone can correct me. That was part of the Grand Alliance, and that directly addressed the past discrimination in the Jewish community. Is that an accurate narrative, tacking on to Nadine's question, which you now have probably forgotten because I've gone so long? But nuance that relationship for us.
Yeah, so there's a lot going on in both of those questions, and I'll start, Eric, with yours, and then move backwards. And this is so important for white Jewish America. Race is socially constructed. So when you're talking about the example of European Jews in World War II, white Jews were not white. In fact, we were subhuman. And the remedy by the Nazis, to use what would have been their word, is genocide. So the idea that just 5 to 10 years after the genocide of the Jews in Europe, that Jews in America are going to be called white is just hard to digest for a whole lot of people in white Jewish America. And as Eric Goldstein wrote, in his first book, and Karen Brodkin, of course, in How Jews Became White Folks, through the 1950s, Jews kind of made it. The anti-Semitic barriers that had been in existence in the 20s and 30s dropped. So now to get to Nadine's question and how it may relate. So there are normally three reasons, like, why did white Jews join blacks in the civil rights movement? And this is about this, co-equal relationship or not. It's normally history, sociology, and religion, which is, Jews know what a bad history is and blacks know what it is, so we're going to come together. And sociology, we both know what marginalization feels like because of anti-Semitism and racism. And by the way, I want to talk about intersectional relations with black Jews and other Jews of color for whom this model does not work. And then the third is Judaism itself, that the prophetic mandate of Judaism demands social justice. Tikkun olam is a new Hebrew phrase we use to describe that. Except, and this is where I'm just going to, this is my, there is no Santa Claus moment for those who are watching. The history of American Jews and the history of African Americans could not be more different. American Jews made it into the middle class by the third generation, maybe even by parts of the second generation. African American history is centuries of chattel slavery, and now it continues in different forms. Sociology, and this is where Eric Goldstein made the contribution. White Jews don't join the civil rights movement until after World War II, when they have already achieved the racial privilege that the United States offered them through the 1950s. So to Nadine's questions, one of the challenges was this was a group that had racial privilege as whites, reaching down to pull up and to help those poor black people, who needed it. The moment you try to have a co-equal relationship, when one group is lifting the other up, and then the other issue is when there's a different racial assignment and privilege as well. And then here's the most challenging part, which all my rabbi friends, have to hear. Most of the white Jewish civil rights workers, the young college students who went south, were leftists, socialists, communists. They were going down with secular civil rights organizations. They were not going down, as part of Jewish organizations. It is true that probably a majority of the white civil rights workers were Jewish. It's also true that these were much more on the secular cultural side of Judaism. So what's happened a lot, and this is why I called the book The Reinvention of It. We invent history. Like, history is true, whatever it happened, but the way we remember it and the way we tell it, by definition, we're inventing it, because we're inserting ourselves into the narratives and into the questions or whatever. And the book is a reinvention because I'm trying to say, okay, all the ways in which we thought about what it was, and invented it that way, let's reinvent it to what I think is a more honest or truthful one. I'll pause there.
Well, how does that break down denominationally? Somewhere in the book, either you or Ilana are saying, well, you would think Orthodox Jews would be most involved, but a lot of them weren't because it's not a Jewish enough topic. And then, conservative Jews were not as involved. Like, I grew up in a conservative synagogue, and even though I grew up in a very integrated community, there was no conversation about this that I can recall. And then but a lot of what was happening was in the reform and other. Give me, is that true?
Yeah. So let me start with the provocative question. Is
Okay.
anti-racist work Jewish or Judaic, to put it in the religious sense? And I think that question deserves a lot of thoughtfulness, because if Judaism demands anti-racism, and by the way, I'll start now with Black Jews once again to say, of course, yes, because when you're asking this question, we're talking about actual Jewish people, right? So in a certain way, merely presenting that question is assuming Jewish whiteness, which is a problem I had when I wrote the book. So I want to just call that out now and say that the Orthodox should have been the leading denomination in civil rights and anti-racist activism from the 50s till now, if halakha, Jewish law, in their interpretation, demanded it. There was, there was some important Orthodox Jews, one important rabbi involved, but for the most part, anti-racist work was not seen as a Jewish imperative, and to add another layer to it, it was seen as something that would take you away from studying Torah. So it actually could be as a secular pursuit, as a universalist pursuit. So not only shouldn't one do it Jewishly, if one did it, it compromises the time you have to actually, be Jewish. Conservative movement, less so. Rabbi Heschel, of course, is the most famous example of a conservative movement rabbi, and there were others. That said, Rabbi Heschel got a whole lot of marginalization from his own colleagues at the Jewish Theological Seminary. He also opposed the Vietnam War a little bit later, and also was seen as too radical, in their mind, a secularist to go and do that. Of the denominations, the Reform movement was the most engaged and active. The Religious Action Center in New York City offered office space for the activists to do that, and in full transparency, I just joined the executive board of the Union for Reform Judaism, so I'm also I'm a fiduciary there and just excited about the work they did. And then saying that most of what went on in the grassroots protest was not from those denominations. It was from Jewish leftists.
So
Wow.
the liberal, let me ask a quick question. So the liberal community, kind of after the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, gets distracted by Soviet Jewry and by Zionism, and also they're now they become white and they're part of the middle class. So it seems to me from reading your book that they basically cede the conversation about Blacks and Jews to the politically conservatives, to, which were always there, because you mentioned that even as 1964, as early as 1964, there are people in the Jewish community who you saw documentation were actually talking about their fear of Black power, but then you have, commentary in Norman Podhoretz, which really brings it out into the open. So is that a fair assumption, or what's happening there in the conservative side of the community?
Yeah, first,
politically conservative side.
I wouldn't say distracted to begin with, because I think that all of the post 1965 Jewish movements were embracing Black power in different ways. So rather than be distracted by what happened, they ran to what happened in a counterintuitive way. And this is where the neoconservatives chimed in as well. So a neoconservative is a liberal who, the joke was a liberal whose kid just got bused, right? They got in touch with what they now see as a reality of liberalism and progressivism, and they've decided that has turned away from the values that they thought liberalism should be. And a lot of that has to do with individualism and meritocracy and hard work and the American dream, and with affirmative action and later quotas. It looks as if the Democratic Party under Lyndon Johnson is moving so far to the left that they've had enough. And now they move, well, we would say to the right, they would say that they're actually the guardians of what liberalism was. The neocons' ability to project their conservative ideology as publicly as they did, to me, happens only in a political climate that says it's okay to engage in identity politics on the political left or the political right. So if Black power is going to go on to the left, and if there's going to be a Soviet Jewry movement, Americans, all these different things, and the neocons are like, we want in too. Now, we're going to have a different political formulation and response to the mid-60s that the others do, but they're going to do it with unapologetic voice. And I argue that Black power gifted American Jews the idea that they could be public without apology. If I could add one thing, this is actually the third title of the book. The second title, the one that I actually submitted, was called Is It Good for the Jews? Power Politics in the 1960s, because that's a question that Jewish people have always asked Jewish people privately about a political issue or a politician. You don't want to ask in public, is something good for the Jews, for fear that, you know, the non-Jewish community will think that you're, you know, that you're somehow un-American or you're advocating for yourself too much. By the late 60s, Jewish leaders are asking, is it good for the Jews in public? They're publishing articles with that as the title, and there is no apology at all for centering Jewish identity in political choices. So I saw the book as like, what happened to the Jews from being afraid to be public with your Jewishness to being proud to be public with your Jewishness? And to me, the fulcrum of that was Black power.
That's fascinating. And Mark, one of the pieces that you raise in the book around Black power and the Jewish community's response in that period has to do around the questions, as you said, of systemic racism, right? So once we start getting to the complicated nuts and bolts of discrimination, not only in the South, which was clearly in many cases much harsher in terms of Jim Crow laws, but as you point out in the book, right, not simply a problem of the South as it moves into the North, and some of the tensions then amplify. Can you talk about the role in the North that you see identity politics play out in both communities during this period, during the 60s leading into the 70s, particularly around schools in New York, Boston, housing segregation? How does that begin to amplify these divisions or points of difference that are beginning to emerge?
Thank you. I had a clean argument until you said housing, and then you threw me off. But I'm going to go with the clean.
Okay, I'm saying.
and then we're going to talk about housing. This is about the difference between a civil rights movement and a movement for racial equality. There was Jim Crow in the South. There was in the books of the South written racist laws. And if the goal of the civil rights movement and white liberal support for it was get rid of those laws, they got rid of the laws in the mid-60s. Then, for those concerned with the struggle for racial equality, and they look in the North and they find racism all over the place in education, in schooling, in policing, in medicine. Yet you cannot find in any Northern law Jim Crow. So from the civil rights movement orientation, all's good in the North. From the movement for racial equality perspective, it's even worse, because systemic racism, white supremacy is playing out informally. And if it's informal, the first thing is it's hard to acknowledge it. So I'll go to housing, which is the exception. It was the American dream. Well, for many immigrants, certainly I study American Jews, to own their own homes. Jews could not own their own homes for two reasons. One, they didn't have enough money yet, in the economy. And two, they were anti-Semitic and now we're talking about white Jews, as well as racist restriction in housing covenants. By the 1950s, the anti-Semitic restrictions were lifted. The anti-Black racists were not lifted. So when American Jews achieved the American dream, and let's celebrate the achievement of the American dream, they ended up participating in, complicit in a racist housing environment. Now, we can defend them by saying that's not what they were trying to do, and this was their movement up. But we want to talk about the relationship between white Jews and Blacks. That point was not missed by many activists in the civil rights community. 1951, the Anti-Defamation League looked at the Jewish community centers that were being built all throughout the suburbs. It's the most ambitious building decade in American Jewish history between synagogues and JCCs. Half the JCCs would only admit Jewish people. I don't have evidence of a Black Jew trying to get in to see what would happen. But of the half that were open to non-Jews, half of those were racially exclusive. So we have instances where Jews moving to the suburbs are not only tacitly complicit in a racist housing system because they're living there, but they're also actively replicating it through their whiteness when they're creating them. And then, of course, this is not in my book, but anecdotally, the first Black family moves into the neighborhood, and all the white families, or in this case, it could even be Jewish families, are going to move out. Not because they're racist, they'll argue because of housing prices, which is just another, spin on racism.
Well, I just want to argue, point out. Hold on a second. No, you want to go?
Go
ahead.
Go ahead, Nadine. I'm going to be quiet. No, I asked the last question.
Okay, I'll be really quick. This is just a quick point, and then we'll go right into your question. I just want to point out that, even in your book, you talk about there are many Jews who push back on that. And one of them is Leonard Fine, who's the co-founder of Moment magazine. And he's out there speaking in the 60s to the synagogue council, and he's basically calling out Jews for basically forgetting the, fighting for racial equality. And so, and then there's like Rabbi Arnold Wolf, who I met when I was younger in Chicago, so there are a lot of Jewish leaders who are fighting against this. And I so it's very complex.
Yeah. So first, I just want to honor the memory of Leonard Fine and just say personally, when I got this position at SF State 20 years ago, he reached out and came to San Francisco, and we got to have a meal together, and he advised me on what it's like, to really, to do what he did. He is, going back to his early days, with Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and then how he's working in progressive politics. I'll say, I wrote an article prior to publicizing this book, and I finished the article, and I was about to submit it, and I looked at it, and it had Leonard Fine all over it so much, I realized this is embarrassing. I've got to rewrite this and find somebody else to talk about. So I actually rewrote it without that. So
you can send it to us. You can send me that version.
I'll do that. There's diversity in all communities, and we only have an hour here, so I'm trying to give sort of the overarching reductionist theses. That said, there are voices, and were voices in the Jewish community that were recognizing what, the thesis I had in the book, and were screaming it from the rooftops as loudly as they could. And you mentioned Leonard Fine. I'll add Rabbi Harold Schulweis, Rabbi Arnold Wolf as well. And these were folks who were pushing against the status quo, calling out, for example, Jewish landlords who kept their businesses in urban areas as they moved to the suburbs, did not keep the buildings up, and then took the profits out of the community. And the folks who are now living in these new urban communities were aware that they were getting a lower grade of service than they should have had, and that the money they're spending is going to the suburbs. For me, just my definition of a hero, a historical hero, at least in the white community, but I think it applies across racial divisions. Someone who risks their power or privilege for the benefit of another, or to be more pointed, someone who risks power and privilege for the benefit of the other. And Schwerner and Goodman, along with Cheney, paid with their lives. That's the ultimate heroism, because they went down knowing what the risk could be to sacrifice to benefit another person. And when Leonard Fine and Arnold Wolf and Rabbi Schulweis are making public statements in that era, and even Heschel, right, that they know are going to cost them professionally, personally, whatever it's going to be, that to me, that captures my attention as a scholar. And those are the folks I'm looking to and paying a lot of attention to, like, what are you saying and when are you saying it and what's happening to you as a consequence?
That's so helpful. And I know, Suzanne, Nadine, if we don't get to questions soon, we know Suzanne.
But we still have a few questions. We have a few more questions to ask.
A few more questions. So I have one question, Marc. So as this is happening in the North, right? So I think it's really salient that you've even nuanced this more. In one way, we can see this as Jews fleeing, right, proximity to Black America in urban areas in the North. But it could also be seen in another frame, a frame we have witnessed continually in this country: immigrants, right? New generations of immigrants fleeing proximity from Black America as they seek to assimilate into mainstream society. We have seen that with other communities. We know Asian American communities, Latino, Arab American, et cetera. We've seen those patterns. The Irish, the Italian. What makes it more volatile, do you think, in your opinion? Why is it that the Jewish immigrants doing the same thing creates a different level of tension or a different narrative than we hold around these other forms of escape from Blackness?
Thank you. What you described in terms of that immigrant process is normative. What's not normative is that white Jews are not a part of it, or white Jews have broken from it in terms of how they react. And I really learned this after the book came out, when I was doing all the Zoom classes. I believe there's an internalization in white Jewish America that, and I'll say our, because I'm going to own it myself, our Jewishness inoculates us from racism. Because we're Jews, because we suffer anti-Semitism historically, because of the Holocaust in the more immediate past, we, of all people, understand what it is to face persecution. Therefore, don't look at us as white people, and don't look at us certainly as anyone who has anything to do with racism. I'll just share, I do advising for Jewish community relation councils and other groups, and I've had many requests to go train professional and lay leaders, in the JCRCs, because they're walking into Black and brown spaces to do political organizing. And in the minds of those people in the room, the Black and brown folk, the white people are coming in. And in the minds of the Jewish people walking in, the Jewish people are walking in, and we're not white. And they need me to sort of help the white Jewish people understand that they are perceived as white, even if they don't see themselves as privileged because of the anti-Semitism. So the stakes are Judaism itself, and whether or not it counts in terms of protecting white Jews from becoming complicit in systems of racism and white supremacy, even as we are victims of white supremacists themselves.
Well, there's a whole conversation to be had in sort of medieval, I don't want to go there today, but we should have it again, about, the medieval legacy of racism in the Jewish community, because there is that ancestral racism, which I think is people still think about, and it's still part of the Jewish legacy. But I just wanted to maybe take us to today a little bit here. This book must have been to the publisher before October 7th. And I'm wondering, what would you include on the next revision, based on that?
It's an awful time. It's a horrible, painful time for everyone. My argument doesn't change. My argument actually intensifies after October 7th, which is to say that, as I'm reading white Jews in America after October 7th, I think we're going to our battle stations here in the United States, and we're trying to what we perceive to be protecting ourselves. And I'm really curious how Eric reads this. In the same way that historical memory had Black power and Black militancy and Black anti-Zionism is contrary to Jewish interests, and I tried to argue the opposite. I think there are fundamental differences, certainly amongst, I'll just say, many in the Black community and many in the Jewish community around Zionism, anti-Zionism, when and if it's anti-Semitism. I'll add that we have a painful and profound intergenerational issue among white Jews even, which is, when the younger generation are more Zionist ambivalent or anti-Zionist. For Jews of color who are caught in an intersectional identity of being both Jewish and Zionist and full-fledged members of communities of color, and also holding that compassion and care that they are holding, for Palestinians. It is so hard. And I just wish we all took a deep breath, inhale, exhale, took a beat, and understood that the divisions within our own families and the divisions across racial lines, however it is actually harming the cause. If the cause is justice and equity. And really, there's so much fear and there's so much anger and there's so much pain. And, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's just going to take time to work through that. But as a historian comparing this, to what's going on in the past, it's more intense than I've ever seen. And it's become more divisive than I've ever seen. And folks don't speak to each other if they perceive them on another side of this, or even if they really are.
It's interesting, Mark. I'm looking at the clock. I know we have 10 minutes left. How fast things go. We promised folks this would be provocative. We encourage folks you could not read the book in a single hour. You're not going to be able to lay out your entire thesis, but I think you have given us real elements to dig into. There's one I can't forget to ask as we move forward here, and it is about the idea you hear within the Jewish community, you hear within some elements of the Black community, not all. Again, those are two diverse communities. But in segments, an idea that the Black Jewish Alliance, as it existed in the 1960s, is now over. And even sometimes you hear within that tone, perhaps I'm going to thumb my nose or my thumb at the other community by declaring this over in this relationship. I'm curious if that's the case. Is the Black Jewish Alliance over? Is it transforming in a new way? I cannot leave this call without asking about the symbolism around Kamala Harris and Doug Emhoff, right? While not the Black-Jewish relationship, they certainly symbolize an aspiration, right, of a new grand alliance. I'm curious from your perspective, how does this look moving into the future? And tell us what folks can learn about answering that question from themselves by reading and studying this book and talking about it and debating it.
Thank you. So on the most basic level, the alliance between white Jews and Blacks is over because it ended in the mid-60s. I'll be cynical in an affirmation, which is maybe that alliance wasn't actually what it was, or at least what people who are thumbing their noses thought it was. Like they're inventing something that never was actually there for the purpose of fulfilling whatever their current day need was. I argued in the book that the alliance reinvented itself on parallel tracks. So there was not proximity between white Jews and Blacks, but there was a strategic and tactical similarity, which brought them together in a new and different way. Concerning Kamala Harris and Doug Emhoff, on the one hand, people are saying, wow, this is, interracial, interfaith marriage, mixed family, like all these things, as if that's new in US history or even American Jewish history. In fact, they reflect the diverse community that already exists today. And the challenge we have in the organized Jewish community is that Jews of color are not feeling welcome enough in white Jewish spaces to come in the numbers in which they exist. So on the one hand, this is like a brand new radical thing to have. And on the other one, I think a whole lot of American families, not just Jewish families, look at the second family now and see themselves in that. And they see not just the future, but I really think that they see today, if not the last 20 or 30 years.
I love that. Can you address the progressive promotion? This is one of the questions. And so, Nadine, I hope I'm hitting the right question here, but I think so. But there was a question around addressing the progressive promotion of intersectionality. And the question goes on to say many progressives are largely hostile to Jews participating in progressive causes since October 7th, including Black Lives Matters, a frame of oppressors of the Palestinian people. The person says, they feel they have supported liberal causes and now feel betrayed. Can you respond a little bit to that, and maybe point to a chapter in the book that might be useful for that person to dig into?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's the number one question I'm getting, since October 7th. The last chapter of the book is what gets into this. First of all, the word intersectionality, it's actually been changed and politicized quite a bit. It was originally a philosophy articulated by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it was specifically about what it is to be Black and female, which is that there's racism against Black folks, there's sexism against women. And when you put those two together, it is actually different and more than just the sum of its parts. That's intersectionality. That was then translated to any of us can have multiple identities that intersect, okay, but that's not what Kimberly Crenshaw was writing. And then it became politicized to say that people of color around the world suffering oppression from white colonial capitalist imperialists have an intersectional connection because they know what it's like to face discrimination because they do too in their country. So that then got applied to the Mideast with Palestinians becoming Blacks and Israelis becoming white, regardless of racial composition of Israeli society. And then you combine that with American Jews getting white racial privilege in the 1950s. And I think for most American Jews supporting the state of Israel and Zionists in some definition, now, in the minds of that interpretation of intersectionality, white Jewish Zionists become the embodiment of racism through their Zionism, if you believe Zionism is racism, and then become an enemy to the progressive cause. And now this is what we call on the college campus anti-normalization, a big word for the idea that you cannot have a Zionist or a white Jew in a progressive space because in this interpretation, the whole goal of the progressive space is not to have them there. And this is really hard for Jews who are the most liberal white ethnic group in America, the second most liberal voting bloc. Only Black Americans vote more liberal than Jews do. And for the person who put up the question and everybody else who has it, it is really hard to be a left-leaning Jew in the current political climate. And then I'll just put a plug in for the new book coming out next year because I'm to talk about what it is to get caught between the left and the right as a white Jewish Zionist.
So the alliance is still really important because you have these two blocks of liberal voting Americans, and it's important for them to work together in a number of areas. So someone here has asked the question, what can we do to strengthen the Jewish and Black relations today, given this environment? And I wanted to really focus on a practical level, like what do you suggest that, someone here today, me, one of us, all of us can do to build this, to strengthen this relationship?
Okay, I'll give you my snarky answer, then I'll be serious. My snarky answer is I'm a historian. And it's tough enough to predict the past. Don't ask me about the future. But I get this question all the time. So
I knew you were going to say that, but it's okay. I asked it anyways.
Yeah. So here's the serious answer. A big challenge we have now is most white Jews do not live or work in proximity with Black folk. And this is a negative part of residential segregation and the rest of it. So I'll start by saying whatever your professional or personal or hobby interest is, go to the organizations in that and get started in anti-racist work there. Begin your relationship to understanding the issues and working for them. If you're a lawyer in the law, that's easy. If you're in medicine, great. I'm in education, I'm doing it here. Anywhere and everywhere racism is present, and anywhere and everywhere you can be involved. And that, I think, will draw you in. Next, and this would be the Nechemta, the Jewish thing that we should end on a happy note because this is really difficult times. All this division that I've been talking about is harming the cause of justice and racial equality, and even the cause of fighting anti-Semitism, because different allied groups that really should be together working are getting drawn apart and against one another. a challenge of the 50s and 60s was the unequal power relationship between white Jews and blacks. There still is an unequal power relationship. That said, when white nationalists and white supremacists have an equal target on both of our backs, sadly, that does give us the opportunity to sit side by side in a greater sense of mutual need, where it's not one group helping the other group, it's both groups helping one another. I, of course, would love to see both groups, and now, of course, referring just to white Jews helping each other, because that's the right thing to do regardless. But if we even put the self-interested part, it's really harmful for us to be firing shots across racial lines when this is the time we need more than ever to get ourselves together.
Eric.
So much to say, Nadine. I know we are at the top of the hour. I bet folks wish we would go 2 hours more. I just want to say thank you, Mark. I can't thank you enough for this conversation. I want to thank Moment Magazine for continuing to open up this space now for well over a year, perhaps almost we're going on 2 years, Nadine, diving into these conversations. And what strikes me is just how much we still are learning from the dynamics of the 1960s. Mark, and your book really shows how those lessons apply so directly to the challenges we face today. And it's a reminder that alliances aren't static, they aren't forever, right? They evolve and they grow and they diminish through tension as much as through unity. And for me, the important takeaway for all of us working across movements is that we have to continue to invest in those relationships that are important. And regardless of whether the past alliance exists, there certainly is a need for a new grand alliance that recognizes the threats and challenges facing both the Jewish and Black community in this moment in the face of rising hate crimes, anti-Semitism, discrimination. And you really help us see through those tensions that we feel today and place them as part of a longer evolution of relationships between these two communities. I hope it helps others lead to a deeper and more resilient kind of solidarity. But it means engaging with one another with honesty and with aspiration. More questions than accusations. So I want to thank you and always thank Moment Magazine for pushing us to have these types of conversations. It makes us stronger leaders. And that's the one choice point all of us hold in these moments. We get to decide, each one of us on this call today, whether we want to be a leader or whether we choose to be bystanders or simply pander to the emotive moment. And I think most of us, after hearing you today, will choose to be leaders around this conversation, no matter how complicated and nuanced that it is.
Thank you, Eric. That's really, I feel the same. And I just want to again show the book because it's fascinating that it covers far more than we discussed, of course, today. There's way more than chapter 3 and way more than a preface and way more than an epilogue. But again, I think chapter 3 is really must reading for all of us. And we have so many more conversations to continue. And I want to ask Suzanne to come back. Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Eric. And I want to ask Suzanne to come back.
Yes, thank you, Mark and Eric and Nadine. As people have asked, will this be on our website? It will be. I know there's so much here. I'm sure many people are going to want to watch it again and again just to digest all of this. As Eric said, this is the Wide River Project. We're looking at deep dives into all of these conversations. And there's been several things that were discussed today that we're going to then take out and do future programs on to focus on some of those issues. Also, I just wanted to throw out there that somebody, when they asked, what can people do? It's about having these conversations and having these conversations in your communities. And so if people are interested in having Nadine and Eric come to their communities in the future, please reach out to me. You all have my email, and we will see about how we can bring these conversations locally. Please go to momentmag.com where you can register for next week's program. And we also have a whole section on our website called the Wide River Project, where you can see all of our past programs as well. Again, thank you, everyone. Marc's book, Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in the 1960s. And we will see everybody next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.